The dawn of the conflict broke with unprecedented ferocity as the German Wehrmacht unleashed the Blitzkrieg. They unleashed this terrifying doctrine upon an unsuspecting continent, shattering the peace of a fragile world. Utilizing a terrifying synergy of armored panzer divisions, the German forces surged forward with relentless power. Screaming Stuka dive bombers descended from the clouds, their engines wailing like banshees over the terrified landscape. The German forces bypassed static defensive lines with surgical precision, leaving commanders bewildered by the suddenness. Nations that had relied on the outdated strategies of the Great War found themselves utterly paralyzed. They were paralyzed by the sheer speed of the advance, unable to react to the shifting. Communications were severed across the front, leaving battalions isolated in the fog of this new war. Supply chains collapsed under the weight of the relentless mechanized assault, starving the defenders of resources. The tactical innovation of combined arms warfare shattered the morale of opposing armies across the continent. Soldiers watched in disbelief as their rigid lines crumbled before the rapid, coordinated, and brutal strikes. This created a landscape of absolute chaos, where order dissolved into the dust of rapid acquisition. Borders dissolved under the crushing momentum of the Iron Tide, redrawing the map of Europe instantly. The world watched in horror, realizing that the era of traditional warfare had vanished overnight forever. It was replaced by a brutal, fast-paced reality where speed was the ultimate and only weapon. Defensive fortifications were rendered entirely obsolete in the face of such overwhelming and highly coordinated aggression. The panzers rolled over trenches that had been dug for a conflict that no longer existed. Every village and town became a waypoint in the relentless march of the German armored divisions. The sky remained filled with the dark silhouettes of bombers, ensuring no respite for the retreating. Commanders struggled to relay orders, but the wires were cut and the radio frequencies were jammed. Panic spread through the ranks as the realization dawned that their static defenses were completely useless. The Iron Tide flowed around strong points, isolating them until they were forced to surrender or perish. This was not merely a battle, it was a fundamental shift in the nature of human. The speed of the mechanized columns meant that the front line was always moving, always shifting. Traditional military doctrines were discarded like refuse, replaced by the cold logic of the Blitzkrieg machine. The roar of tank engines became the soundtrack of the continent, drowning out all other sounds. Dust clouds rose high into the air, obscuring the horizon and hiding the true scale of. Every hour brought news of another city falling, another strategic point captured by the advancing forces. The sheer efficiency of the German advance left no room for hesitation or tactical regrouping efforts. Soldiers who had trained for years for trench warfare found themselves outmaneuvered by the rapid pace. The psychological impact of the Blitzkrieg was perhaps more devastating than the physical destruction it caused. Men stood frozen in their bunkers, watching the steel monsters pass by with terrifying, mechanical indifference. The world had entered a new age, one defined by the relentless pursuit of total victory. No fortification could withstand the combined weight of air superiority and mobile, heavy armored ground units. The Iron Tide was a force of nature, unstoppable and indifferent to the suffering it caused. As the sun set on the first day, the map of Europe was already irrevocably changed. The old guard of military leaders looked on with dread, knowing their time had finally ended. The Blitzkrieg had proven that speed was the most lethal weapon in the modern arsenal today. Every defensive line was a trap, every static position a tomb for those who held them. The relentless, mechanized assault pushed deeper into the heart of the continent. With every passing hour, there was no time to mourn the fallen, only time to run or to be captured. The synergy between the tanks and the aircraft created a seamless, deadly web of tactical control. The chaos of the battlefield was orchestrated with a precision that defied all previous military understanding. Nations crumbled like paper houses under the weight of the Iron Tide sweeping across the land. The world held its breath as the old order collapsed into the abyss of this war. The speed of the advance meant that the enemy was often behind them before they knew. This was the dawn of a new, darker era for all of humanity to endure together. The Iron Tide continued its relentless march, indifferent to the borders it crushed so easily now. The tactical innovation of combined arms warfare had forever changed the face of global military conflict. Static defenses were now nothing more than relics of a past that had been violently erased. The Blitzkrieg had succeeded in paralyzing the continent, leaving it vulnerable to the Iron Tide's reach. The world watched in horror as the reality of this new, fast-paced warfare took hold. Speed was the ultimate weapon, and the German forces wielded it with a terrifying cold efficiency. The landscape of chaos was the only thing that remained after the panzers had passed through. Every defensive fortification was rendered obsolete, a testament to the failure of the old war strategies. The Iron Tide surged forward, an unstoppable force that redefined the very meaning of total war. The era of traditional warfare had vanished overnight, replaced by this brutal and fast-paced reality. The coordinated aggression of the German forces left no doubt about the outcome of the conflict. The world was forced to adapt to this new, brutal reality or face total, certain destruction. The Iron Tide had arrived, and the world would never be the same again after today. As the Blitzkrieg reached its zenith, the strategic landscape of Europe was irrevocably altered by the conflict. A trail of occupied territories and broken alliances now stretched across the once peaceful, verdant continent. The sheer velocity of the German advance forced a radical shift in global military thought everywhere. The rapid fall of major powers demonstrated the lethal efficiency of mobile and highly concentrated force. While the initial shock of the offensive succeeded in securing dominance across the entire European continent, the overextended supply lines began to stretch thin under the immense pressure of the rapid expansion. The emergence of determined resistance movements introduced new, unforeseen complexities to the ongoing, brutal military occupation. The momentum that had once seemed unstoppable started to face the harsh friction of rugged geography. The hardening resolve of those who had been pushed to the brink began to manifest slowly. This transformative period of warfare not only redrew the maps of the world with iron ink, but it also set the stage for a protracted, grueling struggle that would eventually test everyone. The limits of the very doctrine that had sparked the conflagration were now being severely tested. Supply trucks stalled on muddy roads as the fuel reserves dwindled in the cold autumn air. Local partisans hid in the dense forests, watching the iron columns crawl through the narrow valleys. Every village became a potential flashpoint for rebellion against the occupiers who held the main roads. The commanders at the front grew increasingly anxious about the widening gaps in their defensive lines. Communication lines were frequently severed by saboteurs, leaving isolated units to fend for themselves alone. The once terrifying pace of the Blitzkrieg slowed to a crawl, hindered by the vast, unforgiving terrain. Generals argued over maps in dimly lit bunkers, sensing the shift in the tides of war. The initial euphoria of victory was replaced by the grim reality of a long, costly occupation. Soldiers who had marched with pride now looked over their shoulders at every passing dark shadow. The civilian population, though battered, refused to break under the weight of the new, harsh regime. Whispers of resistance spread through the cities, carried by the wind and hidden in secret messages. The Iron Tide had reached its peak, yet the ocean of history was beginning to turn. New strategies were being forged in the crucible of this desperate and increasingly complex global struggle. The world waited in breathless anticipation, wondering if the momentum could ever be truly regained again. Every mile gained came at a higher price than the last, draining the nation of resources. The doctrine of speed was now colliding with the immovable object of human will and endurance. History would record this moment as the turning point where the unstoppable force finally met resistance. The era of easy victories had vanished, leaving only the cold, hard truth of total war. Heavy armor ground to a halt as mechanical failures plagued the aging, overworked panzer divisions daily. Mechanics worked through the freezing nights, their breath misting in the pale light of dim lanterns. Spare parts were scarce, forcing crews to cannibalize disabled vehicles to keep the remaining ones moving. The vast distance from the supply depots meant that ammunition and rations were dangerously low now. Soldiers huddled in shallow trenches, listening to the distant rumble of artillery echoing across the plains. The silence of the night was often broken by the sharp crack of a sniper's rifle. Fear began to seep into the ranks, replacing the earlier arrogance of the initial, swift invasion. Officers demanded more from their exhausted men, ignoring the signs of total physical and mental collapse. The maps on the walls were covered in red ink, showing territory that was increasingly difficult. Every town captured required a garrison, further diluting the strength of the main, advancing combat force. The occupation forces found themselves fighting a war on two fronts, one against organized armies, and another against the invisible, persistent threat of the local, underground partisan resistance networks everywhere. Railways were sabotaged, turning vital logistics arteries into twisted metal and burning, useless, smoking wreckage. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, striking from the shadows before vanishing back into the woods. Intelligence reports grew increasingly dire, warning of massive buildups beyond the reach of aerial reconnaissance. The strategic initiative was slipping away, replaced by a reactive posture that favored the defensive side. Commanders realized that the war of movement had devolved into a grinding, static, and bloody attrition. The dream of a quick, decisive conclusion to the conflict faded into a long, dark nightmare. Winter approached with a cruel, biting frost that threatened to freeze the very soul of armies. The landscape turned into a white, desolate wasteland, burying the roads under deep, heavy, wet snow. Vehicles became trapped in the mire, turning the once mighty columns into easy targets for the enemy. The cold was a silent, relentless killer, claiming more lives than the bullets of the opposition. Morale plummeted as the realization took hold that the promised victory was slipping further away daily. Letters home became shorter, filled with longing for warmth and the safety of a distant home. The high command remained detached, issuing orders that ignored the grim reality of the frozen front. Discontent simmered in the barracks, fueled by hunger and the growing sense of an inevitable doom. The Blitzkrieg had become a trap of its own making, consuming the nation's youth and wealth. History waited to see if the crumbling facade of invincibility could withstand the coming winter storm. The final chapter of this grand, tragic experiment was being written in blood and frozen earth. Everything they had fought for was now balanced precariously on the edge of a total collapse.